This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dalia Shenlin.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. We're counting on you. Every week, Dalia and I bring you interviews with authors of books, researchers, and other people that we find interesting.
This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany is now holding the EU presidency for the second half of 2020, and the Tel Aviv Review is holding a special series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries and with Germany, with the generous support of the German government. As part of this series, we have a very special guest today. Actually, it's a first for the Tel Aviv Review, and we're very pleased to welcome Germany's ambassador to Israel, Dr. Susanne Wassum-Reiner. Ambassador Wassum-Reiner holds a PhD in law, and she has a long career as a diplomat. She served in Morocco, represented Germany at the Office of the United Nations in Geneva. In the 2000s, she served at the legal department of the German Federal Foreign Office in Berlin, and then as the legal advisor to the German government. Over the last decade, she has served as Germany's ambassador to France and then Italy. And after a previous posting in Israel in the 1990s, she is the current ambassador. We will be talking about Germany's role in Europe and the world, global affairs, and Israel. Ambassador Wassum-Reiner, welcome to the show.
Shalom.
Shalom. Let's start by asking you about this new role that Germany has holding the rotating presidency of the Council of Europe. What do you think Germany hopes to bring to this role? What do you think should be the hallmark of German leadership?
So Germany is taking this role as presidency of the European Union that it had, of course, also in the past. It's a rotating presidency in an extremely difficult period of time. So we changed the priorities for this period in the course of the pandemic that we all globally suffer. And we are aware that this presidency is going to be, in the shadow also of this pandemic. But it is a presidency where we have the firm intention to lead the European Union and the member states of the European Union out of the initial big crisis. So it's about tackling the health crisis, and it's about overcoming the enormous negative economic consequences.
This is also a very challenging time for the EU, even well before the pandemic. Ever since 2016 with the referendum on Brexit and Brexit itself. And in recent years, there seems to be an increasing divide between older and newer members of the EU, which often overlaps with Eastern and Western countries. What grade of health would you give to the union aspect of the EU right now at this challenging time?
So first of all, the European Union has seen many serious crises since it came into existence, really on the ruins of the Second World War still. How it was established, the European Union was already a mastering of a difficult situation. But it has seen many crises. And the last one was the financial crisis that was very bad economically for many of the European countries. But maybe just before the pandemic started, as you mentioned it, with populist movements, right-wing movements, with fake news, with a different atmosphere of governments, a different communication style with all those digital media, there is a situation that became difficult for the European Union. And it was maybe the most difficult crisis because it was a kind of a crisis of identity. So that is something that we take extremely serious. And we Germany, we are firmly convinced that Europe is not the problem, but the solution of our problems. And we have to strengthen the conviction that this European spirit and that Europe gives us our sovereignty and independence, all of us are seeking.
Can you already assess the impact of Brexit? I mean, you mentioned the populist rise, that Brexit is perhaps the epitome thereof. Also, in terms of the identity crisis, it's the first time in history that European integration has turned into disintegration of sorts, right? It's the first time in history that this process has been, to a degree, undone. But also in terms of the economic impact of it. Because, as you said, we are entering now uncertain times economically with the pandemic and all. How will it affect the European Union now that I think it's the second largest economy in the Union left?
So first of all, let me underline how deeply regrettable all of us think is Brexit, and how deeply we think that this was not the best decision that could be taken, and how very narrow it was also, the outcome of this referendum. And we see how maybe it was also manipulated. I mean, there is recent reports that underline that again. The first thing I wanted to say is that the 27 states proved how they stick together. It was not possible to divide us over the necessity to build new rules and to have new treaties. All of the sevens stay together and have proven an enormous spirit also of protecting Europe.
But I want to know how devastating really you think it was. Or was it just a bump on the road in a way?
Well, or let me maybe clarify. Are you trying to say that even though it was a blow, it also exposed how cohesive the remaining countries were?
This is what I wanted to say. Mm-hmm. In a way, the UK was one of the most successful countries within the European Union. It got all kinds of exceptions for anything. There was always this spirit that the UK needs some special rules. And the UK was part and parcel of the development of the European Union on the 40 years it was member of the Union. So it formed and created, together with the rest of us, what we have today. And I think it's regrettable. This decision is a wrong decision, but of course we fully accept it, and I mean with full respect to the people of the UK who took this narrow decision.
I want to go back to what you said earlier about the current presidency of the EU that's going to be blighted by the pandemic and the response. In the European Union, traditionally, there's been this tension between the sovereignty of the Union and of the member states as independent countries, this battle of sovereignty, of responsibilities. How do you think that's going to play out in the European response to the pandemic, both in terms of public health policies, but also the economic fallout?
I think this notion of sovereignty is a difficult one. And I'm firmly convinced that to reduce ourselves to our small nation states, I mean, Germany is a tiny country when you look on a global scale, this would not make us sovereign. But I'm convinced that with the shared sovereignty of the 27 states and our 500 million inhabitants, and putting together our synergies and living through and living with our diversity, which is a pure richness, this will make us sovereign.
But is there anything, any central agency now going to tackle the European response to the pandemic?
We don't have a European government, but we have strong European institutions. And yes, it is. We don't have the government of the European Union, but we will put all our strengths together and we coordinate, and under the notion of solidarity, we will get us through that period. At the beginning, after the first shock, after the arrival of the pandemic, each of us did different steps, but the exit of this, these restrictions we had to take, and you have seen the enormous financial and economic decisions that have been taken at the recent Council of the European Union, will bring us together out of that crisis.
So from the focus on the last few months, I want to go back to the beginning. You referred to the earliest stages of the creation of the EU. And I want to talk about how the EU emerged out of an attempt to create an alliance that would both respond to the Second World War, and help build institutions to prevent conventional war in the future. How was the EU conceptualized to do that?
I mean, it started before this union came into being, and it started with reconciliation among European countries. And there was, above all, the reconciliation between France and Germany, which is key to understanding Europe. I mean, France and Germany had 300 years where they had basically every 30 years another war. And then after the Second World War, there was the decision that this has to stop. And there were very, very courageous politicians, men and women, who said we need to reconcile these two states.
Could that have been conceivable 20 years before? I mean, these two countries that had been at war
No,
for so long.
that was not conceivable. It was very, very courageous. And it was probably also difficult at the beginning for people. I mean, people who were deeply hurt and who had lost loved ones, etc. It was after a war. But this idea of the power reconciliation can be to change the future for the better for our kids made the European Union. And at the beginning, it was not a political union, as you know. It was an economic group, and it was also something to contain Germany at the beginning, the industrial power of Germany. But from that very early beginning, the union, the political union, was only a third or fourth step in the development of the European Union. Came the union into being that we are today. It's a huge, huge success story.
And why do you think that the model of shared sovereignty, as you put it, is the model that evolved in order to help keep these peaceful relations? What is the connection between this sharing, to some extent, of sovereign powers and the fact that Europe has remained peaceful for so long?
I mean, it's, I think, simply the awareness or the knowledge that all the small countries we are, Germany, for instance, with less than 1% of world population, will never, ever be able to tackle the problems that are the problems of today. Migration, climate change, financial crisis. I mean, this you can only do together. It's not possible for individual states, and Germany is still one of the biggest, if I may say so, within the European Union. So, but within this big group, we can achieve a lot, and we will have a voice globally, which we, as all our small countries, great but small countries, won't have.
To what extent do you think that the global impact of the European Union and, of course, of Germany in it can still grow, bearing in mind that public opinion within the European Union has not overwhelmingly, but to an extent, turned against it with the rise of populism and, anti-refugee sentiments. There's less inclination on the part of the population to play a global role in solving these problems.
I would be careful about the big generalization because each country is a little bit different and each population within each country can
and
be
the
divided on public
history
opinion.
of each country within the European Union is different. I mean, the Eastern and Central European countries, they have a very, very difficult history even after the Second World War, and there was a lot of suffering. So each of us need time also. We have a concept of life within the European Union. We are built on the enormous respect on human rights, dignity of people, the freedom of people, the freedom of everybody to choose its own way of life, to be responsible for his own happiness, bonheur. And I think this social concept is something that is extremely precious for European countries. We guarantee this freedom. This is, of course, a different model of society. I mean, China might have a different model of organizing society, a different approach to human rights also. And I think this is something that makes the European Union particularly precious and makes it as a concept of governance particularly convincing. So we have to fight for that. I agree. We have a difficult moment in time. We have to digest certain problems that some member states brought within the community, but I'm convinced that we will be
Do you
able...
think it's already happening? I mean, is there any response to those developments?
There were countries deeply disappointed by the European Union. And I think what we did last week with offering shields of protection with tremendous amount of money for all member states in need show the people that Europe is able to protect. I think we are on a great way, on a good
And what
way.
about showing the countries that are a little bit more skeptical of the liberal democratic model inside their states? I'm talking about some of the newer member states and particularly the problems with Hungary. How do you try to advance these values that the European Union holds dear for countries that say, well, we want to be part of the Union, but don't tell us what to do inside our countries?
Well, this is not possible. I mean, you're a member of the European Union, and then there is something, a spirit we have together, rules we have together, standards we have together. And you saw that in press conferences after the latest council that people said, okay, our system was stronger than the other. Okay, we have to live with that. But of course, I hope that within all those democratic states we have, this will prevail. The feeling how precious this state of law, the protection of human rights, how precious it is. And the pandemic, I think, is a time where we had such strong restrictions, where we had time to be aware of how important this is. And as we say in Germany, the pandemic certainly is not an excuse to restrict human rights. So it shows what a responsibility we have.
But the policy of the Union is still persuasion, right? Telling people how good.
We are not a dictatorship.
No, that's what I'm saying. But
and we don't have a central government again.
No, but you don't see the prospect of any sanctions of any kind on rowdy member states clamping down on liberal democracy within their own countries.
We have mechanisms within the European Union that might be applied, and they need the consensus of the rest of us, and we will discuss then what we want to
So it's
apply.
not off the table. It can still happen.
Of course, we apply the rules we have.
Tell us about some of the institutions that have been constructed in order to try to advance these ideas that there are universal values of justice and human rights and the post-war human rights regime that has evolved. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. How have these evolved to try to safeguard and advance those values?
Well, this has nothing to do with Europe. Then this is a global...
Right, we want to move in... I should have said we want to move into the world, sort of post-war world order.
I personally think that the Charter of the United Nations is a great, great document. And I know that the United Nations is not particularly an institution that is loved in Israel. But the Charter already contains human rights, the guarantees of individual freedoms, and is already an important brick in the building of a rules-based international order. And the International Court of Justice was already part of the Charter of the United Nations, but the International Criminal Court is an institution that is very young. It took us, let's say, from the historical processes against Nazi criminals of the Nazi government until the 2000s, until this project came into existence. And it came into existence on the basis of an international treaty among member states who agreed that this new institution is going to be founded.
Right. And yeah, I want to just reiterate that I was hoping we could shift to a little bit to the sort of post-war order, because we're talking a lot about these things now, especially with some of the challenges in Israel. But before we get to Israel, you did spend time as the legal advisor to Germany, and I know that you've been involved in advising the German government in its position on some of the major cases at the International Court of Justice, for example. I want to talk about two of the major principles that define the post-war order. let's start with self-determination and not talking about this region. I want to briefly bring in the issue of Kosovo, since I know you also were involved in advising on that decision. And our listeners cannot see, but you are smiling because you probably don't have an opportunity to talk about it very often here. But it was a very important ruling that the International Court of Justice made in 2009 after Kosovo unilaterally declared independence. Tell us how the idea of self-determination was such a key factor in the dilemma that the court faced over Kosovo.
This was a very difficult case and a very difficult history also, because self-determination, it has also a destabilizing element. If you look at, Scotland or Bavaria, who declared to become independent now, that would not really stabilize the world. So we needed criteria how this could work. And in the case of Kosovo, Germany felt, together with many other countries, that everything had been done before to help the Kosovars to become independent. And it was a difficult case where there were many pros and cons, where Germany supported this endeavor after many resolutions of the Security Council, after wars, in a situation of a tremendous suppression also and violation of human rights for a long period. There we thought the moment had come, and this brought the case to the International Court of Justice.
And so after having tried every other, when you say Germany supported every other means, in other words, to prevent...
Also Kosovo and the international community. It wasn't Germany.
Right. But the idea was that there was support for other means for Kosovo to be able to stay within Serbia. But then ultimately the court ruled that the Declaration of Independence did not violate international law, essentially allowing Kosovo, in a way, to maintain its Declaration of Independence as a way of fulfilling self-determination.
Yes. Mm.
Let's go to your relationship with Israel. I mean, you are the ambassador now, but before that, you served in the German embassy here. I think you were cultural attaché in the 1990s, and I think you were here for a very formative event in our lives, and apparently in your life too, the assassination of the prime minister. Can you tell us about your first connection with Israel through those experiences?
My first connection with Israel was much before that already. I was here already as a student, and I had my first contacts with Israel was in a law firm of a lawyer in Jerusalem when I got my own legal education. That had left a very strong impact on me. It was he was a Holocaust survivor. He had lost literally everybody, his whole big family during the Shoah. But he somehow became, the most influential person in my life, probably, and at least a very strong friend. So, with this background, I came here as Nisbachat Tarbut.
Cultural attaché.
Cultural attaché.
And your Hebrew is perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And,
we did not expect that.
And the assassination of Rabin, as for every Israeli at the time, was also unbelievable, strong event. I was at this demonstration Kikar Malchei Israel at the time, Rabin Square today. And I had left a bit earlier because there were so many people and I felt I didn't want to stay in the traffic jams. So I just left when everybody was starting singing. And when I, in the radio of the car, I heard that, and like everybody else, I was like also the whole German embassy. We were sitting, there and crying and couldn't believe what had happened. Yeah.
Is Israel today that you return to is very different from the Israel you left?
It's very different, yes. But
how is it different?
Well, it has changed a lot. It is a tremendously successful economic power, a young state. Tel Aviv has changed a lot. It's a tremendously successful state. And of course, it changed like we all change. How is it possible that you won't change in in 10 or 20 years. So, but there's still, I have friends from the time of my first stay here. They didn't change.
But what about your work as a diplomat? Is it? I mean, you are doing a very different role now.
I have a different role, but it's not so different. I think the relationship between Germany and Israel grew. It is much more self-evident that it exists. It is, of course, never forgetting the past, very much oriented towards the future. It is based on so many different fields, and it is such an intensity of relationship. And it's also in fields that were maybe not so foreseeable. I mean, the military cooperation is enormous, and I mean, in all fields, it's not only politics, it is science, it's economy. Germany is one of the strongest economic partners of Israel. It's exchange of people, it's scientific cooperation. There's so many things. It's so broad and very intensive.
So much more than before. You're saying that it's deepened on all these fronts.
It's deepened on all these fronts.
And despite that, sometimes there are policy disagreements. There can be disagreements between friends. And we've seen the chancellor say critical things about settlements, and Germany took a clear position against the annexation. With such a friendly relationship, with such a sensitive history, how do you manage when there is a policy disagreement, a legitimate policy disagreement? Or in some ways, maybe Germany has in a way more ability to be carefully critical of Israel because the relationship is so strong. I mean, we see if Sweden says something critical, then, the foreign minister gets blacklisted. But Germany is in a different position. How do you manage those kinds of questions?
I think we have a particular responsibility. And as the German chancellor said in a famous speech at the Knesset in 2008, the security of Israel forms part of the German, let's say, raison d'être, raison d'état. And you have seen how we try to deal with differences of opinion. In the middle of this pandemics, the German foreign minister came to Israel, respecting, of course, all the sanitary regulations, and just for a couple of hours, because over the annexation discussion, Germany felt concerned. So when he came, he said, I'm coming from that country that is one of the closest partners of Israel, and I'm one of the closest friends of this country. And in this capacity, I come and I tell you, my friend Israel, that we are concerned, and that we are concerned for different reasons. And he said also that sanctions is not an instrument that we hold applicable with regard to Israel, but we share our concerns with the leading politicians of that country. That's what we did.
Since we'll have to wrap up soon, I'd like to go back to what you said earlier about to the discussion that we had earlier about Germany's role within the European Union now as president, and also its global impact. We did discuss Brexit and the rise of populism and the challenges within Europe proper, and also its sphere of influence. And we must not forget, the same sentiment, the same sort of development happening across the pond in America, with also the current American administration making the country turn on itself in a way. What do you think is Germany's global role in these times? Angela Merkel has been dubbed since 2016 several times the leader of the free world, right? By default, in a way. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Germany's role is always a role within the European Union. And our answer to America First is Europe United. And what I have to say that the transatlantic partnership for Europe plays a decisive role, and that the friendship between Europe and the United States is something that is extremely important for us, and that we will work with all our powers to protect it and to develop it further.
But do you think there's a greater necessity now? There's, Germany and Europe are being forced into playing a more global role now with that in mind?
Europe has to feel and be responsible for its own security, and we can't rely on other countries for that. But we are convinced that the problems we are facing, we can only tackle within a transatlantic partnership also.
Just recently, Germany was ranked for the third time in a row as the world's most admired country in Gallup tracking surveys. Used to be the US. Since 2016, it is not. What is Germany doing right that you could imagine causes people around the world to say, I approve of Germany?
How difficult to answer.
I thought that was going to be I thought you were going to be so happy about that question.
All right, so what is Germany doing wrong?
No. Let's end on a positive note. We have a difficult world. Let's end on a positive note.
I do agree that we have a great chancellor, and that we took courageous decisions, like also with regard to migration and to also climate protection. And Germany has become a country with a very diverse population. 1/4 of the population has a migration background, but it tries to have the identity of people living in Germany being formed by this human rights approach, etc. So I hope that this is
very concise.
Yes, absolutely.
Very concise and very focused.
All right, Ambassador Susanne Wassum-Reiner, the Ambassador of Germany to Israel, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for your interest.
And also many thanks to Itai Shalom, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the German government for sponsoring the series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. All you have to do is go into the ratings and review section in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has, I think, already 600 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. And if you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast. It is from Israel. And do not forget to follow Dalia and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.